Welcome to the Higher Ed Demand Gen podcast, helping higher education marketing leaders share knowledge about learning, strategies, and tactics that are relevant today. See what you can learn today by listening to one of our episodes.
Welcome to the Higher Ed Demand Gen podcast, hosted by Concept 3D. If you like our content, please follow and subscribe to us. As always, I am Shiro Hattori, your host, and today I'm very excited to talk about Higher Ed Podcasting 101. And for the topic, I'm really thrilled to have Robert Lee join us today. He's a founder at professors.fm and university.fm. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Thank you. Sure, it's a pleasure to be here. And really quick, I just got to say, I think you're doing a really, really amazing job with the podcast as a podcaster myself. Been following you for a long time, so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate that a lot. I know we got to connect in person at AMA in Vegas a few weeks ago, so it was great to meet you in person as well. I do have an icebreaker that I ask all my guests, which is, please tell us what you love about higher ed.
Yeah, I'd say what I love the most about higher ed, I think when it's at its best, they're bastions of places for discovery and critical thinking. And that's also connected very closely to why we focus on podcasting for higher ed, because it is a process of sharing stories that help people learn more about the world around them, and also being able to gain a knowledge and think more critically when they, I guess, live.
Right. Yep. I think higher ed brings everyone up, so I think that's a great point. Well, let's jump in here. So you have a lot of things going on, right? So can you tell us briefly about all the companies you're running and a little bit about your background as well?
Sure. So there's two companies. So one, Professors FM, and the other, University FM. They both work really close, hand in hand. Really together as a full service podcast PR agency. So what that means is that we help higher ed teams. So they could be comms teams, that could be presidents, students, professors, helping them with the podcast strategy, the production of the show, the marketing of the show, and also podcast media training and booking. So everything podcast related. How I got into this space was, about 5 years ago. I was a student at the University of Michigan. And when I was there, I was a part of the WCBN radio station, so the student radio. And that's where I started getting into audio storytelling and really falling in love with that process. While I was there, interviewed students, also interviewed some faculty. And around the same time, my brother, my co-founder, Sean, he was studying at UC Berkeley. And when he was there, he did student podcasts. And basically, we got together one of these winter breaks and talked about, hey, what it would look like to help other universities get into this medium.
And how long have you been doing this for?
Yeah, so 5 years total, and every single year learning something new, adapting as higher ed is overall, and learning kind of the intricacies of working with universities and colleges, and intricacies of what is important from the higher ed institutions, and how to communicate that to a broader audience who's not so deep within academia.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. And I know in our previous call, just to get a feel for each other, you talked about how there's kind of like 4 main categories of podcasts that exist in higher ed today. And I loved how you broke them all down. So could you share that again with us today?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just preface this. So we kind of happened upon these categories because when we work with universities, we realize that there's certain types of podcasts for, of course, certain different goals depending on who we're working with. So within the university, you have your president podcasts, so very hot thought leadership at the highest level, and then you have your podcast with alumni, so it's like alumni relations, trying to feature career success stories or provide lifelong learning. Then you have this category of podcasts with students, and so that's like more student learning opportunity, and also tied with, say, students or enrollment podcasting to share the student's story. And lastly would be this, working with faculty experts. So there's more research podcasting, where you're trying to translate complex research ideas into layman terms, into relatable stories for a broad audience. So those are broadly the 4 categories that we've recognized as we work more specifically in higher ed podcasting.
Gotcha. And I know I've had Kate Young from the This Is Purdue podcast on this show before. I love their podcast, by the way, and everything they are able to create from that. Where would
Yeah.
that fit into like the categories, or does it kind of have some overlap?
Yeah, definitely overlap. I actually saw add a fifth category here, and what we call is like the official university podcast.
Right.
The because that's what Kay Young does with This Is Purdue. Again, fantastic show, and also her as a host, she's fantastic. As a person, she's fantastic. So check it out if you haven't yet. But official university podcast, because the overall goal of that type of show is at the highest level trying to build the brand of the institution and trying to show all the different aspects of the university, from the research to the student experience to the community engagement. So it's unique in the sense that it's powerful with its lack of focus in a way.
Yeah, no, to increase that brand awareness, and you can kind of pick and choose from each one of the 4 categories beneath
Yeah.
it. So here's my understanding, or my thought of how many official university podcasts there are out there. I feel like there's very, very few of them, and there's many more professor highlights, student focused, alumni focused, and president focused podcasts out there versus official university podcasts. Is that assumption? Do you think that's also true as well, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think the lack of official university podcasts is because of 2 main reasons. One is it is inherently difficult to have a podcast like that be successful because it's not so focused. Um, and when I say that, the important note is you want the podcast to be focused because then people who are listening to the show will understand what to expect from the show. And so if they were to become subscribers or longtime followers, they know exactly what they're coming to the show for. For university podcasts, when it's that broad, sometimes people, other than want to hear stories from that particular university, they don't have a bigger reason to engage. This to Purdue, I think, is a very unique example because the Purdue brand is already so strong, and they have such a strong alumni, student community base. So just because it is Purdue, they will listen. But I think if it's like a smaller university, smaller college, less likely it'll be successful. So that's one. Just less university podcasts because of the lack of focus or less focus.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the second reason is there's definitely been people who have tried creating university level podcasts, but there's just a lot of difficulty with that, mainly bandwidth.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to cover and coordinate with so many different, I guess, entities within the university. That at some point, if you feel like you're not making as much progress or impact as you want to, then it's very easy to just slowly get out of the habit of publishing, and then slowly the show goes away.
Interesting. Oh, related to to all the things we just talked about, let's say your goal is to influence enrollment marketing. My assumption is like a student podcast is probably the best theme to start with for that. Do you have any ideas or thoughts there too?
Yeah. I think it's important to remember that the podcast is an extension of the overall communication strategy. So for us, like the podcast never leads the strategy. So if the strategy were, hey, we want to feature more student stories, then that'll be the route to go with the podcast because it'll match up with the rest of all the content that's coming out. But if the communication strategy was maybe more focused on talking about the admissions process, then you would have a different flavor of this, where it's a podcast focused on the admissions process, maybe between international students and domestic students, or different phases of that process. Like I can say, another good example to check out here is I forget what it's called, but it's a law admissions podcast between Harvard and Yale, and it's all about the admissions of how to get into law school generally. That worked really well. If I use then more maybe like case example again, like when she features the or actually, no, let me take it back. So if I use an example of a show that we do with Howard University called From HU to You, that one features episodes that are of current students who are talking about really inspiring things that they're currently working on. And so that would relate more or relate better to prospective student listeners. So two different flavors there of how podcasting could tie in with the enrollment marketing column strategy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I like how you brought up the point with law school because that's very specialized, and in most cases, schools are turning down students, and so it's like a helpful piece of advice to students versus like maybe a central comms team running a podcast for enrollment marketing. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there will definitely be some different flavors with that. So great
Yeah,
point there.
and I think um, you know, when thinking about what prospective students are interested in, perhaps through surveys or such, you find out, hey, they already have enough information about the admissions process. That's not the focus, but maybe they're interested particularly in certain programs, and so the podcast could focus on program highlights. Yeah, another flavor.
Yeah, which would tie in more of the professors and faculty, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
So in that scenario, a lot of people who listen to podcasts generally, I think, would know about Freakonomics, which is an economics show coming from these 2 professors who teach at the University of Chicago. Freakonomics, the podcast, same book. Freakonomics, the book. And there's definitely cases where students really consider applying to the University of Chicago just because they follow these professors and really appreciate the research that they're putting out there and sharing, and they want to go to a university where they can have that same sort of learning experience. So that's another way, another flavor of how a faculty research podcast could attract students.
Okay, I like this because I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this towards the end, but how you can create almost like a personal brand if you are a very influential professor, and how that could generate demand in the future for prospective students. So I like that. Cool. Well,
Mm-hmm.
great. Can you tell us a little bit about the lay of the land in podcasts and higher ed? I know we just we just went through a pandemic, and that was a crazy time, and you've had some observations about what happened from like 2020 and now. um yeah, just tell us a little bit about like kind of what happened in the last 5 years.
Yeah. So I'll say that we started out. It was during COVID, and if you remember at that time, yeah, everything is shut down. So you're just trying to figure out how to create experiences in the virtual world. And during that time, a lot of people then started thinking, okay, why don't we start a podcast? Because people are just at home
Mm-hmm.
and they can listen to this. It's a great way to engage with audiences internationally, not just regionally. And it seems like it won't be as big of a lift as, say, creating like a whole video series or something like that. So the general idea that most people had was, let's start a podcast and let's just interview interesting people. And what we found, or what we found out, is that a lot of those shows that started during COVID from universities, like today, they don't exist anymore. Like they're inactive. And a big reason for that is they're probably not seeing the results that they expected. Um, and so the learning lesson here, I think, is when you start a podcast, being very clear on the strategy for that podcast. Because again, a lot of these shows just started out by just thinking, hey, as long as we get interesting people as guests, like it'll go fine. But it's more than that, right? Like before the guests, you really have to be clear on who your target audience is and why this podcast exists and what is this podcast perspective that's different from all the other content that's out there in the world. So yeah, from COVID, huge burst in podcasts. And over time to today, a lot of those shows are inactive. But I think at this current stage, podcasting feels like it's getting to more maturity within the higher ed industry. I definitely see, as I have more conversations with communications directors about podcasting, they're much more intentional about wanting to make sure like, hey, if they're going to do a podcast, which there's a lot of interest in doing, if they're going to do it, then how do they do it right? How do they make sure that it's successful enough that it's a continuous effort rather than just doing one season and being disappointed?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think, I mean, from hosting this podcast, I know there's a huge value in podcasting just because the content you're creating from it is you can break it down into so many different pieces of content, right? Like this is going to be a video piece, right? So I can create video clips from them. And so I could imagine if you're interviewing a student about how they're liking their current, let's say, business school program, right? Not only can it become an episode on the show, you can now create video clips from them, maybe even a full video episode. You can create blog content from it. It can help think of other ideas, and it turns into a lot more from, I think, very little work in comparison to your example of like creating a video series where there's a lot of work that goes into the production, the planning, um, securing the guests, etc. And I think it's just such a good piece of content. So I'm glad it's starting to mature.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're knowing here is kind of the kind of flywheel that can be built off of a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the strategy we follow in terms of content creation for sure, because podcasts, most of the time, they are a long form piece of content. On average, episodes range between 30 and 40 30 and 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you have some that are like below 10, some, more than an hour. But within that 30, 40 minute range, you really allow the conversation to get deep into topics. You really allow people to explore the conversation. And from that, as you're mentioning, there's so many clips you can make from it for short video, for repurposed like social media cards, for content for a newsletter or like an article. And that's just a wonderful way of, I think, achieving efficiency with podcasting. Start the podcast, create all these other things from it.
I like that. We talked a little bit about production efficiency. So what are some of like top 5 things you need to, you said a lot of podcasts have now are now inactive, which started in COVID. What are some like tips, maybe 3 to 5 things that help to make sure that you can continue a podcast, given that you do have clear goals and audience set already?
Yeah. So given that you have all set, one of the biggest challenges logistically is the scheduling process, because most of these podcasts are interview podcasts. Scheduling, so one example would be if you're making a president podcast, yeah, scheduling is likely going to be the biggest hurdle you have in some ways, because the president is so busy and they have only so many windows of time, and you have to match that with the guest. And assuming that's the president podcast, the guest is also probably pretty high profile, so their schedules are busy. And then you have to coordinate it with like the production team of who is actually going to be, say, on that call right with them. So one is scheduling, and the way to get ahead of that is, hey, schedule early, schedule in advance, and also do bulk scheduling. So what that means is go ahead. It's better to schedule, say, 2 or 3 interviews in 1 week rather than one interview for 3 weeks, spread over the 3 weeks. That'll make the bulk recording easier. And then all of a sudden, with that scenario, you take away the bottleneck of scheduling, so you can go ahead and do your post-production process in your own time. So it gives you more flexibility. So one will be the scheduling aspect. I think second one, in terms of efficiency, would be the revision process. So sometimes, I'll say how we do it. So the process that we found most efficient is after the recording is done, then we'll start the post-production for all of the assets, meaning the audio, and at the same time, the episode artwork for it, the show note, the transcript, the social media, the video tied to it, but do that all at the same time and just have one full round revision for all those assets. Something else that we do is that in the revision process, we have all the feedback collected in the transfer documents, so we can accurately see, okay, if there's a specific segment of this episode that needs to be taken out or just edited, you can highlight it, make a comment for it, specifically what the change should be. So that's how we handle the revisions process to make it super quick, super easy, and with confidence that you're getting all the revisions done that you plan for. I'll just stop with those two.
Okay. No, appreciate that. That's great. And I know all this kind of leads into, so you've had 5 years of experience working with a lot of higher ed partners now. What are some common themes that you've seen that you should not be doing? I know you had a couple examples in our pre-call, but I think one of them was around like, not turning your podcast into a stream for announcements.
Yeah. So let's start with that one. Yeah, podcasts are not announcement tools. I personally, I think announcements are so great for like newsletters or just written announcements, quick email announcements, right? The podcasts thrive, and what they're built for is when you can have deep one-on-one conversations or small group conversations to dig into topics. When it's announcements, there's not much to dig into. Just say what it is. Yeah, another thing to think about is prioritizing which metrics for measuring success. So oftentimes, the first metric that comes to people's minds is down numbers. And down numbers, yeah, that's a good metric to keep in mind, but is it the best metric for what your goals are? So, for example, recently we just produced a podcast called Belonging at Haas. So that's for UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. And it's a podcast for their DEI initiative. And it was specifically built for current Haas students. So with that in mind, they were very targeted in their audience, and current Haas students like that size, the amount of people is not that large. There's probably a couple hundred. And so you're not going to expect your downloads to be, say, in the, even into the high thousands, right? But the more important metric for them probably would be the listen through rate. So how much of an episode are people actually getting through when they listen to it? Because that's a better way to see if this content is resonating with the people you meant it to resonate with. On that note, really quick, I'd say a good listen through rate is like 70% and above. That's really good to aim for. To put that in context, like if you had a 30-minute episode, 70% of that would be about 21, 22 minutes. So that's a lot of time that somebody is dedicating to listening, engaging with your content. And I'm just comparing that, say, 22 minutes maybe to like a 1-2 minute article read or even like a 5-minute video. So there's a lot of value in how people spend the time with you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of a third one here. So I guess, let me see.
I think one example you covered was around research based or professor, like kind of related to professor highlights, and how I think you mentioned more to focus on outcomes and learnings versus like the process of the research study.
Yeah. So when it comes to faculty research podcasting, something to keep in mind is the podcast should not feel like lectures. Podcasts are not lectures. It should not feel like a monologue, and it shouldn't feel like a lecture in the worst sense, meaning it's boring and you're just sitting there hearing somebody talk at you, right?
Yeah.
Rather than actively teaching you with examples. So there are podcasts out there, research podcasts out there where the faculty talk a lot because that's what they're good at. But they give so much detail that it turns off, people who are not in their academic circle.
Mm-hmm.
So the best thing to do here is when it comes to faculty research podcasting, make sure to have a pre-call with that person to be clear on their key messages, say 3 key messages they want the listener to take away from this, and to prepare examples for those 3 key messages so that when you get to the podcast, instead of talking through, say, how the research was conducted, you can talk about the key findings of the research and how they're important or why they're important to society today in what context. Because naturally, that storytelling element will just bring people so much more into the conversation than hearing how the white paper was made.
Yeah, I think that the word that really sticks out to me is like find the story in your research, and I like that you said storytelling because I think ultimately that's part of what we're doing as podcasters. So that's great. And I know you tapped in a little bit on the measurement and the KPI aspect right before this one too, and I'm glad we covered that because I'll give another example from this podcast, the Higher Ed Demand Gen Show, hosted by Concept 3D. One of the key measurements I look at is not just the download of the episode, but I'll look at the micro clip, so the video clip I create from this episode, for example, how well that will do on my LinkedIn profile. And usually I can gauge, if I had a good guest who has a good social reach, and if the clip that I had my editor make was a good video clip and was valuable to our audience, and I can see how many impressions and shares and reposts it got. And so that's like a measurement I actually look at more because more people see the video clip than people download on the podcast streaming platform. So I use that as my metric.
Yeah. And I think it's a really great point because generally, so my approach, how I think about analytics, is you're not just collecting numbers,
Mm-hmm.
but you're trying to collect enough numbers to interpret them for decision making. So in that previous example I was giving about downloads, if that's like the only metric you're looking at, if you see an episode's high downloads, another one's low downloads, you can maybe glean a little bit of insight from it, but you don't really know what action to take. So more about the analytics process, because this is pretty unique to the podcasting space. Like podcast industry in general is very, in my opinion, very far behind in terms of what analytics they provide versus say YouTube video or like your Google Analytics for your
Mm-hmm.
website. So generally what is provided on these listening platforms is your down number, your follower count, sometimes, not all the time, your listen through rate, and then maybe a geography, right? So that's what you start out with. And how we approach this is we collect that data from all the podcast listening apps. And then there's also, to your point, like a second level, which is collecting the data on the social media or the extra content generated, like what the interaction is with it. And a third level would be running a listenership survey, and which allows you to dig deeper into the listening behaviors of people, so that you can really look into, okay, for example, we just did this for Rice University. For the people who have never listened to this podcast, what are the reasons they don't listen? And if it lists that the reason they don't listen is because they prefer listening to other podcasts, then okay, let's dig one level deeper. What is it about the other podcasts that makes you more interested in them than this show, right? Or another way is, how did you first find out about this podcast? And based off of that, then how do you find out about new episodes? Because that's going to really provide context for making decisions about what actions to take to get this in front of more people, right? So that's that's what I want to say about analytics. It is super important. Generally, podcasts are not good at providing information on it, but there is a way to analyze in detail so it is more helpful for yourself.
Gotcha. And this actually touched on a point that I wanted to dig a little deeper with you on, which is around how do you market a podcast? I know that some of the services you provide, and it's important to the success of the podcast. Do you have any advice? It could, be very just simple basics to anything you've seen some creative things that your partners are doing.
Yeah. Quick point for context, like there are many amazing podcasts out there that don't get that many listens. And I want to say that because I think a natural reaction for some people is that when their podcast isn't getting the number of downloads, say, that they want, they immediately think, oh, the content must be the issue. Like something about the content should be improved. But what I've found out over time is that it's actually more about the promotion piece, because you can make a really fantastic show content wise, but people just don't know about it, right? And generally, I would say you should spend about 60% of your time on the content and then 40% on the promotion. Whereas some people spend like 95% of content, 5% promotion. So some good ways of doing marketing or like podcast growth One, I say on social media specifically, to reach new audiences, short video is your friend, and like YouTube video is your friend because of how those algorithms are built out. It really promotes your content to new people. Whereas, say, social cards, like audiograms, on say your Instagram, they're only going to your current followers. So not such good of a tool for reaching new audience, but it is a good tool for engaging your current audience. All right. So social media wise, short video and video generally is a way to go. Second way of approaching marketing is through guesting on other people's shows. So say that you have a host who is an expert in whatever this podcast is about. They can guest on other shows in related areas, related fields, with audiences that share similar interests. And we find this to be really successful. If you can find a good host guesting opportunity, when you do that, you're going to bring a new audience from that existing show who's already interested in your topic. So that one's really effective. A third way is like cross promotions. So another aspect of podcast partnerships. Again, you find a similar podcast to your topic, and you would cross promote each other maybe through 10-second, 50-second clips to say, hey, you should check out a show, but in much more of an interesting way. All right. And then I think a fourth way to approach the marketing as a university is to really, really leverage your university channels. Like make the strategy for putting podcasts into your variety of newsletters, into your social media feeds. Even for some of our clients, they put the podcast on their digital boards, like those TV screens on campus.
Yep.
All right. So really leverage that. On this point, when you start a podcast, like a new show for your first time, the launch is very, very important because that's going to be your first impression. And if you can like get a lot of attention with your launch, it's going to make your life a lot easier in continuing to grow the audience. So for launch specifically, I say one more thing is to consider paid media just to reach a broad group of people up front.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I should have taken your tip on the launch part because I think I did a quiet launch just to see how the market would react, but I think more time could have been spent in that preparation. So really helpful advice. And I know there's a couple things brewing in that we talked about before that you're really excited for. And I know I'll let you speak to those.
Yeah. So, as a company, we work with a huge variety of types of shows, right? Like we were just talking about. Recently, I've been more focused on trying to figure out how to help more faculty engage with podcasts around this general idea of public scholarship and conveying, or through public engagement, conveying the value of higher education overall, raising the perception of the value of higher education. And by sharing this knowledge in applicable ways, improving society, right? Helping more people be aware of this knowledge that we have, but it's just not communicated out there. There's a challenge that I've discovered as really interesting, which is that I hear often that faculty go to their comms team, their university comms team, wanting support for a podcast. And the university comms team wants to do it, but they don't. And the reason why is because bandwidth. Because there's this thinking that, hey, if we support this one faculty member with their show, then we probably have to commit to supporting a lot of other people as well. So I understand that. And then, and it's an interesting dynamic, because the need is there, the want is there to do it, but there's just some practical barriers. There's a bandwidth and being very, very straightforward, right, with your restrictions, with your limitations. And so, I see it kind of play out two ways. One is, okay, maybe the comms teams can make a broad faculty podcast to feature people. That could work. Or more often, that conversation just gets pushed off. And over time, nothing happens in terms of podcasting, right? So what I've been trying to figure out and what I've been testing is with the comms team offering kind of three, three services, maybe to try to help solve this, to help elevate or help the comms team scale their ability to help faculty. We're exploring and putting out, podcast media trainings for faculty and
Okay.
podcast bookings to go along with that. Because if you don't have the capacity to have your own show, or say you don't want your own show, that's okay, because you can still get involved in podcasting by being a great guest on shows that are very relevant to you who already have existing audiences. So we can help you do that. The third route would be or the third service option would be producing your own show. In which case, right now we're working with comms teams, but also working directly with the faculty, kind of making faculty influencers, even if they don't like to think of it that way. Like they could be their own influencer, create an old brand based off of their books. Now you have a podcast, build a newsletter out of that, do your social media out of that, maybe even create like a subscription out of that, right? Because you have very, very, very like many dedicated, that's the word, dedicated followers, right? Because that's a model that we've seen be successful. There's of the top 10 podcasts, like one of them is by Andrew Huberman, who a lot of people know nowadays, professor over at Stanford University in medical school, talks a lot about biohacking and good practical health tips. And that show, just to give us some context, episodes are about 3 to 4 hours long. But people get through the entire episode, and those episodes have like millions of downloads. So there's definitely interest in it. And it's a proven, I think, case study for how other faculty can use podcasting for themselves, if not with the university comms team. So that's what I'm excited about, just figuring out how to navigate this space to help elevate more and more really fantastic teachers into the public sphere.
Yeah, no, and I love that we went full circle on this, because I know you talked about Freakonomics and how that's been driving students to want to take classes with those professors. And I've also listened to an episode on nootropics, I think, from Andrew, the guy you just mentioned. It just clicked in my head that, yeah, he was also a professor as well. So like, yeah, if I'm a student or a potential prospective student, that'll definitely help me drive demand, because I think naturally we're tied to people. And what a great point that you've made, that you can create these professor influencers. I know they probably don't want to be called that, but that's essentially what they'll become.
Well, I'll say one more thing about this, which is when we work directly with the faculty, it does leave out the comms team. But what I've learned is that, hey, that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, as long as we create this content with the faculty. The comms team doesn't have to be involved. They don't have to spend resources on it, but they can trust that we'll send them promotional material so they can still use it to promote the institution's brand and highlight whatever new initiatives are going on. So it's interesting because some comms teams we welcome this. It's like, yeah, we know we want to, but we know we can't help the faculty. But if you can provide us whatever you make, go ahead. And this is cool because I just learned this. So for Huberman's podcast, the Huberman Lab, he just launched like a subscription maybe 4 months ago or so. And people who subscribe, part of those funds goes into Stanford research.
Oh, wow.
So there's also now this kind of fundraising element too that goes along with the faculty podcasting. And that's exciting. Back to your original question.
Yeah, no, this is great. And I know we're just at about time here, but I'm wondering, with any of your partners, do you want to give a shout out on the one podcast that you're really excited on? Whether it's you've been doing it for a while, it's about to launch with one of your partners. And also, where can people learn more about what you're doing, and where people can go to learn more about starting a podcast?
Yeah, I would call out. So we've been working with them for about 2 years now. It's a podcast over at the Stanford Graduate School of Business,
Hmm.
and also in partnership with Warden over at UPenn. So it's called All Else Equal, and it's a podcast about making better business decisions. Uh, it's really interesting to me in particular because it gets at challenging common assumptions and really pushing you to think a little deeper about whether these assumptions maybe communicated by mass media are actually true. Gives you the facts and just lets you evaluate yourself. But back to teaching or providing people a way to practice their critical thinking skill. So again, all else equal, you can find it anywhere you listen on podcasts, and that's by Stanford and UPenn. Overall, again, Shiro, thanks for having me on the show. I'm going to say if people want to learn more, we do have learning resources for podcasting, our own podcast guidebooks. And I'm sure you'll be adding to the show notes. It's on the university.fm/learning. Also, if we could, I'd love to include a link to some case studies so that you can also see how the different types of podcasts benchmark against each other. Like what kind of results do they get? Because that's a question I get a lot, which is, hey, or for people who have their own podcasts, they always ask me, or they always tell me that they don't know whether the podcast is doing well or not. And so I think the case studies would be really helpful resource just to help people benchmark for themselves.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely add those to the footnotes. So I appreciate you, and I have to check out this All Else Equal. I just opened it on a tab, so I'm definitely gonna take a look at this podcast. Thank you so much for joining today. It's been awesome.
Yeah, appreciate it. Keep it up.
Thank you, Robert.